Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Big welcome to all of us at MRSI. I'm Ashwini Kupeja, your host for today's a special webinar on the impact of COVID. But before we begin, I would like to talk a little bit about the Market Research Society of India and also talk to you about the initiative that we have taken. MRSI is a not-for-profit association of providers and buyers of research and insights. The core purpose of MRSI is to create awareness of our industry, to establish and promote professional standards, and also to provide a platform for market research professionals, not just to engage, but also to showcase work and to collaborate. On the next slide, I would like to talk to you about the initiative that market research and the MRSI is driving. Now, as you all would be aware, that market research in India is predominantly a face-to-face and relies on freelancers, interviewers to collect data to provide insights to vast a variety of corporates, governments, and social bodies. Due to the current lockdown situation, there has been a complete stoppage of face-to-face data collection, and hence, number of our freelance interviewers' livelihoods are impacted. MRSI has partnered with Habitat for Humanity India to create a relief fund for helping selected freelance interviewers nominated by our member agencies in these crises. We request your generous contribution, and very rupee will count. For more details, you could visit our website at the MRSI website. Just to let you know that till date, we have about 44 members who have contributed, and I'm sure some of you are perhaps attending today's webinar. So thank you very much for your contribution. I request you to spread the word, and we have collected about 10 lakhs, and we really would want to collect more. So your participation, your support would be really helpful. Thank you so much. Now, just before moving on to the next one, I would want to talk to you about today's webinar is very special. It's explicitly about market researchers. It's about how market researchers are coping with pandemic and what support and help do they seek or do they need. So this on the next slide, I would like to mention that this webinar is based on a survey that was conducted. So joining us today for this session is Ray Pointer, who is from the new MR. Ray will unfold the results of this survey, which covered about 2,000 researchers around the world, and a special emphasis on India. A little bit about Ray. Just on the next slide, please. So Ray is, I'm sure some of you would have attended a few sessions conducted by Ray, but I'll talk to you about the work he's done. He's the founder of New MR.org, a fellow of the MRS, and a member of SMAR Council. Ray has written books on market research. To name a few, he's an author of the Handbook of Mobile Market Research, the Handbook of Online Social Media Research, etc. He spent about 40 plus years at the intersection of innovation, technology, and market research. Ray's mission is have fun, help people, pursue knowledge, and try to make some money along the way. But before I hand over the mic to Ray, I just want to have a few webinar callouts here. This webinar is recorded to enable members who could not join us today, and the webinar will be available to them on demand from the MRSI website. We have put everyone on mute to avoid background noises that may distract us from listening to the webinar. But the chat functionality is available throughout the webinar. So should you have any questions or comments, please feel free to type in, and we will collate all of them and bring it forward. We will have the speaker respond to your questions at the end of the session. Now, without any further ado, let me welcome our today's guest speaker, Ray Pointer. Ray, all over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome everybody. So let's start with the elevator pitch, just the very top line information from this study. We've talked to 2,000 people around the world, and it appears that most people in our industry who we have spoken to are coping, but about 1 in 5 are not. And of course, as a priority, we need to look after the people who are not coping, as opposed to being happy at how many people are coping. Globally, about half the people we have spoken to have seen their incomes drop already. We asked them what do they want the leaders of our industry to do, and they said they want our leaders to look after our people, and it was fantastic to hear about the initiative for the freelance researchers and the interviewers in India. There are similar programs in many other countries too, and this is fantastic. And they want to see our leaders advocate for research to make sure that brands understand they need to keep doing research if they are to have a better chance of getting out of the current crisis. In India, one key pattern that we see is that many people who responded to our survey are working more hours or the same hours, but they're doing it for less or the same income. So the agenda for today, I'm going to tell you why you should trust this research and why you should not trust this research. I'm going to share with you the key findings, some supporting evidence, and then we're going to tackle the so what question. So why should you trust this information? Well, there's plenty of data. That's always a good start. 2 waves of data, over 2,000 interviews globally. From India, we had 87 interviews in the first wave, 116 in the second wave. So we've got information to look at. The data is recent. The first wave was at the end of March, beginning of April. The second wave, the end of April, beginning of May. We've got responses from 79 countries, and we have a mix of closed and open-ended questions. But it's a convenience sample. It was widely distributed. Many of the associations, including the MRSI and SMR, helped us distribute it. We used social media, but there wasn't a proper sampling frame. And one of the things you will notice in the data is that we do not have a large sample of freelance Indian interviewers, people who are struggling the most in India, because these people are not connected to the same social network systems. They are not using English to talk over the internet. The survey was in English only. So what we do see is that the study overrepresents English-speaking countries. It represents what people say. And when we ask questions like, how are you today? Some people are more prone to say how they feel. Some people are less prone to say how they feel. And of course, some of the people who are struggling might not have been able to respond to the survey. So a lot of people who work for market research organizations have actually lost their jobs. So those people may not have the email accounts that we associate with them to be able to respond. So there are obviously concerns about the sample. I think there is a lot we can learn, but we shouldn't take it as being absolute truth. So everybody likes to see an international comparison. And here is the data from both of the 2 waves. One of the interesting things for us is that there were almost no differences between the results from wave 1 and wave 2. They were only about 3 or 4 weeks apart. But we thought that maybe during the crisis, there would have been more differences. There were very few. So most analysis is an overall analysis. And here are all of the regions where we had enough data to be able to report. And India, as you can see, is in the red group of countries, the companies that are less happy. We showed people 5 faces and said, which ones represent you? This is the percentage that picked one of the 2 smiling faces. There are no statistical differences between the UK and Latin America. All of that group are broadly equivalent. They are less happy than the total sample. Canada and East and South Asia are very much in the middle. And then we have the countries that were the most likely to pick a happy face. Predominantly, that is New Zealand. Other than New Zealand, it's Europe except UK. UK is an outlier as far as Europe is concerned for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that I always find reassuring when I look at market research data is when it tells me things that are obviously true, because that gives me more confidence in the areas that I'm going to investigate later in the study. And here it tells me that people who have fewer problems are more likely to pick a happy face, and people who have more problems are less likely to pick a happy face. So the people most likely to pick a smiley face, aged over 60, and there are lots of other studies that show actually we have a U-shaped happiness distribution, and people like me are over 60 tend to be happier. New Zealand, where there are fewer problems, are happier. People who normally work from home are happier at the moment. People who work similar hours are happier at the moment. People who are in Europe but not the UK tend to be happier. People whose income has not changed, and people who say, yes, working from home suits me. By contrast, who is less happy? People who say working from home is not good for me. People who have lost their job, people who are working fewer hours, people whose income has gone down, people who are living alone, and people who do not normally work from home. So no surprises there, but it is reassuring. But there is an important reminder. Not everybody whose characteristics fit the left-hand column are happy. Not everybody whose characteristics fit the right-hand column are less happy. You can't just judge, oh, this person, they're used to working from home, they've got a home office, their income's okay, they're not going to be worried. They may have a relative with diabetes who is at risk of death from COVID, and they may be very worried. So as researchers, we know that we should be doing employee surveys on a regular basis, and we should be reaching out to people to find out who are the ones who are struggling. One of the questions we asked in both waves is, where are you working at the moment? And globally, 86% of market researchers say, I am working from home. And in India, of the people we were able to speak to, and this tends not to include these freelance interviewers we mentioned, 86% of people said, yes, I'm working from home. 10% of the people we spoke to globally said, I'm not working at all. So almost nobody. It's 5% in the office, 3% a bit of a mixture, but principally our industry has moved to the home. If we take those people who said they're working from home, we ask them another question and say, does it suit you? Globally, 82% said, yes, it suits me, but that falls to 71% in India. So it's not working as well in India. And we looked at the characteristics of people who said that it was working less well for them. And the characteristics are people who do not normally work from home, people who picked a sad face. Well, picking a sad face doesn't make it bad at home. Making it bad at home makes it more likely you will pick a sad face, I think. People in India and people aged 21 to 40 have more of an issue with working from home. So in the second wave, we also asked, are you working more, fewer, or the same hours? So ignore the numbers in brackets for a moment, therefore India. So we'll start off with a global picture. About a third of people are working more hours, about a third of people are working similar hours, and about a third of people are working fewer hours. There is no clear pattern. It's going up, staying the same, going down. In India, there is more of a pattern. Nearly half the people we spoke to are working more hours. So these are people who are still employed, and they're having to work more hours. Only 20% working fewer, 27% working similar. We also asked, since the pandemic started, what has happened to your salary? And again, we'll ignore the numbers in brackets first. About half have got a similar income, about half have got a lower income. Only the lucky, very small number of people have a higher income. In India, the pattern is pretty much the same as the global pattern in terms of income. So if we do a simple cross tabulation, it's not surprising that people working fewer hours, nearly 70% of them have got lower income. And perhaps a bit more surprising is that the people who are working more hours, nearly 40% of those have got lower income. If we now show the data for India, we need to be careful with the sample size here because this was only from the second wave. But we see that most of the data, 31 and 57, is over in that similar hours, more hours. And 42% of them are getting a lower income. So the people who have got a job are working harder and in many cases getting less money, or they're working harder and getting the same money. When we look at who has been hit by fewer hours and lower income, the pattern is really, really clear. The most impacted group of people globally are the sole traders, the recruiters, the interviewers, the freelance translators, the freelance moderators, the freelance qualitative researchers. These people have all been hit really, really hard. Now, we've underrepresented those people in the data in India, but we know from what we heard a moment ago about how difficult life is for the freelance face-to-face interviewers in India. Fewer hours, if you're not working, you're working fewer hours. Well, that's kind of obvious. People in Africa, Middle East and Pakistan tend to be working fewer hours. People who've got a lower income are associated with fewer hours, and people in small companies. So the sole traders are most impacted, but actually companies with 2 to 9 people, pretty heavily impacted too. Lower income, sole traders. Australia, it looks as though there's been a very systematic response in Australia to reduce salaries of employed people. So lots of traders have lost money, but actually employees of large companies and medium-sized companies in Australia, a lot of those have seen their salaries reduced. People who are not working have a lower income, yes, of course. Working fewer hours is associated with lower income, being in Africa, Middle East, and Pakistan. And people who had a lower income were more likely to pick a sad face. Now, this is a slightly complicated chart, so I will run through it slowly, but the findings are very stark. The size of company you are in has a really big impact on how the pandemic crisis is impacting you. And we see this is from the global data. If you are in a company of just one person, the sole trader, 61% of those people are working fewer hours. The small companies with 2 to 9, 10 to 49, 50 to 99, so this group in the middle, 2 to 99, they're working, not so many of them are doing fewer hours, but quite a lot. And by the time we get to companies with 100 or more people, only 1 in 7 say I'm working fewer hours. So this is a really big impact by company size. If you're in the larger companies, you are not likely to be working fewer hours. If you're a sole trader, you are very likely to be working fewer hours. If we ask about the same hours, we see that the sole traders are unlikely to be doing the same hours. Then it doesn't really matter whether you're in the 2 to 9 or the 50 to 99, about a third of you are working the same hours. And this jumps up for the people working for companies with 100 or more. And now we put in the third piece of that data. If you're a sole trader, almost nobody is working more hours. But if you're in a 100+ company, 40% are. So between those two, in the 100+ companies, the employees are telling us that 83% of them are either working the same hours or more hours. So now let's look at income. And if you are a sole trader, 77% of you are saying my income has gone down. But if you are in the 100+ category, a third of you are saying your income has gone down. If we look at similar income, 2/3 of the people in the 100+ companies are saying my income is the same. But over on the left-hand side of the chart for the sole traders, just 17% are saying my income is the same. And pretty much nobody is saying a higher income. So we can summarize this that if you're a sole trader, you've got less work and less money. If you are at a company with 100 plus employees and you haven't lost your job yet, then you are likely to be working the same or more, and you're likely to be having a less income or the same income. So quite different patterns depending on the size of the company, and the middle size companies are in between those two pictures. It's an open-ended question. We ask people, what do you want the leaders of our industry to do? And the top two categories of mentions accounted for nearly 50% of all the mentions. So this is the first of these top two. We want you to look after our people. We want you to look after the physical and mental welfare, and we want you to help with the finances. And there have been lots of initiatives to do this by associations, and we saw the MRSI's initiative, and this is fantastic. And the second one, and these two between them make up 50% of everything people said, advocate for market research. Brands need research now if they're going to navigate out of this crisis. These are unprecedented times. People who are running brands and organizations do not know how to manage. Their gut is useless into these circumstances. They need research, and we want to see the advocacy. There were some other things that were mentioned. I'm going to highlight two of them. The first is prepare for the future. We have to manage what's happening now, but we need to think about the future. And the future is not just online qual, it's not just smartphones. It is changing the way that market research delivers insights and outcomes. This is a big pressure that was happening before the pandemic crisis. And we must make sure that our industry, when we come out of this crisis, is heading in the right direction, the direction of delivering more value, of making research faster, making research easier to use for business makers, showing the ROI. And of course, we do need to go digital and virtual. The one that people keep talking about is qual, but it's not just qual. It's all the steps in the process that we need to make sure that we're moving ahead to the next stage. Now, there is lots and lots more data in the report. I've just skimmed through the highlights here. And if you would like a copy of the SPSS file of the cleaned raw data, you're welcome to have that for further analysis. So almost the last thing I've done is I've pulled out what are the key differences between India and the rest of the world. And the first one is disruption. Compared with the rest of the world, the average place, the people in India were more optimistic that this disruption will only last 3 months. And I guess it depends on whether people are talking about the COVID-19 disruption or the economic catastrophe and the change in travel patterns that will come with it. The data from India was more male. It was much more likely that people were in large organizations with 100 more people. People in India were more likely to be working more hours than people in the average location. There were more people in the home than in the average location. People in India are less likely to say they normally work from home. And this may be one of the things that changes as a consequence, and part of going digital may be to facilitate more remote working, which may not be home. It may be local places around. The data from India were much more likely to be from people aged 21 to 40. They were more likely, not likely, but more likely to be people who said working from home does not suit me, and slightly more likely to be sad. If we look at where the data from India was lower systematically, then ignore the top one because 0% is lower than 2%. That's statistically significant, but it's meaningless data. But the next one down is much less likely to be aged over 40. Much less likely to think that this is going to be a long-lasting disruption. Much less likely to work for the smaller companies. And I think that partly reflects the sampling issues. Less likely to be in small households. Less likely to be working fewer hours, less likely to be female, and less likely to say working from home suits me. So what? The key thing we need to realize is we need to be operating with two mentalities. There is the 3-box method for an innovative company. We probably need the 2-box method for dealing with this. Part of our effort has to be coping with what is happening now. But that is pointless if we don't take care of the future and decide which direction we're going in and what do we want to be when we come out of this process. The good news is that most people are coping. So the most urgent task is to find the people who need the help and provide that help. You can't detect who has got problems just from circumstances and demographics. There are lots of other things that happen in people's lives. So we should be using our research tools to keep really close track on how our people are doing. We've got to advocate through research, and we should do that through collaboration. We don't want individual companies saying, you should be doing our research, because we want a lot more saying you should be doing research. You should be doing all these different sorts of research. You should be working with the trade bodies, with international groups to make the case for research. We want to embrace the future, which includes digital, but it's not just digital. It is also about new ways of understanding clients' needs, focusing on clients, delivering those things. And for India, the key issues are going to be the global recession. So will a lot of work that is currently done through India not able to do in that way? In terms of the people who replied, we got a lot of information from larger companies. They've got a very specific set of problems. And in India, the challenges of working from home. If we find that COVID comes back next year and the year after, then the ability to carry on working from remote locations, the implication for, do you have a place at home that is suitable to work? What is the internet? What is the software platform like? All of those need to be built into the process to make market research much more resilient to these sorts of things going forward. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Thanks a lot. This was really very insightful and engaging, and I think that that really helped us understand a lot of things in terms of how the data is playing out. But before we just kick off the Q&A, I just want to touch upon a point that I did in the beginning about the initiative that MRSI is playing out. So requesting all the members to please spread the word and help us support our freelancers whose income have stopped due to the current situation. So requesting your support and participation. Now, before so just getting into the Q&A, while I get the questions pouring in, I would like to touch upon a point related to productivity. So Ray, you mentioned about the future impact of COVID and if it comes in again the year after and so on and so forth, and we perhaps need to factor in elements that will help us get better prepared. But in the current situation, while yes, working from home has its advantages, but it comes with certain challenges. There are households which aren't that big, but then people are quite preoccupied with a lot of other things. You know, they're worried about the family, the friends, the day-to-day practical concerns. So does it really help does it, while you may end up working more, but are you really more productive at home?
That's a great question. And we did for Wave 1 quite a lot of online discussions, and we followed some themes through. And there were some questions in Wave 1 as well about how people's time. What is quite clear is most people are less productive working from home, even if they normally work from home. So I've worked from home for the last 10 years, and for the whole of April, I was less productive because I was worried about other things. I was doing things differently. I was looking at how many people had died each day. I probably spent 30 minutes just looking at the numbers from different parts of the world in the UK. And then after doing that, I would spend some time thinking about those numbers. So I think that there is a quite separate issue between how do we make working from home technically suitable, and we should try to do that. But at the moment, we are going to have some real problems with productivity because there are just so many other worries and distractions. And maybe one final point, we also need to think how we're going to train people in the future if working remotely is a bigger part of the process. It's fine if somebody's got 10 years experience and they're working independently, but if somebody has only got 3 months experience, it's very hard for them to work remotely.
That's a great point. Great. The other question I wanted to touch upon is one of the key advantages of working from office. There is a face-to-face connect with colleagues, with agency partners, etc. And when you have a face-to-face connect, and we're so used to having the face-to-face connect that in some way or form, it propels the learning experience, so to say. You exchange ideas while you do have technology to enable that, but a face-to-face brings its own charm. So, was there any specific mention in the research that in the absence of face-to-face connect and with the social distancing, would it have an impact on self-development, learnings, etc.?
I think that there's a lot of different patterns. So we see some people who are talking about, we've added in the social side. So people are using Zoom and Teams and things like this to have Friday afternoon drinks and things like this. So people are trying to do those things. People are trying to use very explicit learning. I think one of the things that we see from the comments and also our broader experience is that very little accidental, very little serendipity happens online. So if you go into a bookstore, you might see a book you were never expecting to see and be interested in it. It's on when you shop online, you tend to see the ones you're looking for. When you read an article online, you don't see the adjacent articles in the way that when you read a newspaper. And similarly, in the office, you hear things that were not intended for you, but which are interesting and then may spark your interest. So you know that this person is more busy because they've not left their desk. You hear somebody talking about the new project and you say, all right, there's a new project. So all of that incidental learning is being challenged. On the flip side, quite often, some of the companies I'm working with, they would have meetings in Melbourne and they would have meetings in Sydney, and they would be quite strongly bonded. But now some of those meetings are happening using Teams and Zoom, and I sit in on the meetings and my colleagues in Malaysia sits in on the meeting, and Sydney and Melbourne don't meet separately because they're all working from home. So there is no concept of Sydney versus Melbourne. So we've got to get our head around what are the benefits of the new ways and how do we compensate for this lost learning by osmosis, because there will be much less learning by osmosis when
Yeah,
we are more digital.
true. That's a great point. There's another question which is very specific to the target group. Were there any specific nuances from the age group of 21 to 40 years that you picked up?
There was a lot of anxiety that they felt that they might be the first people to be cut, that they were going to be the least likely to be looked after. And so the main thing from the 21 to 40s was anxiety. And the second thing, and I'm now in my 60s, and every 10 years or so we have a recession. And one of the things I notice is that young managers think this came from nowhere and the world shouldn't be like this. And so this pattern is quite a normal pattern that people who are younger, this is the first major change they've seen. So it has a much bigger impact and tends to shake them a lot more. So in general, the 21 to 40s have been socially and psychologically harder hit. They will often live, and they're looking at this now globally, they will often, at the younger end of that, under 30, will be living in less good accommodation. They'll be living in smaller accommodation. They will be sharing houses, or they'll be living at home with parents, depending on where in the world we're talking about. And all of that makes things more difficult for them.
Sure, that's a good point. I want to also check with you if you have any specific advice for some of the young researchers who perhaps have just started a journey in this profession and unfortunately are experiencing a very unique situation, a lockdown wherein they're not able to exchange any of their ideas or anything of that sort they would have perhaps when they were doing things face to face.
Yes, I mean, my general advice would still apply now, which is if you are in the early part of your career, you want to become an expert in something. And it almost doesn't matter what the something is. So it could be in analyzing semiotic information. It could be in using R for statistical analysis. It could be in data visualization. So that would still be true. But the second thing that I would urge younger people is to realize that online and in social media, a lot of the normal barriers are not there. If you make a good suggestion online, it is much more listened to than if you make a good suggestion in the office where people have already assigned by where you sit and who you sit next to shapes your position in the organization much more. But actually, if we have a town hall or we have a contribution a session, or there's a brainstorming session that you can join in online, all of a sudden the hierarchy is much flatter. So if you are a 25-year-old, you're new in the industry, feel confident to join in those conversations. And you will probably find that you are being listened to much more digitally than you would have been if you were raising that in a face-to-face situation in a busy, crowded office.
No, I think that's a beautiful point. And I'm sure that would be very encouraging to young researchers and all of us in general. There's one more point which is quite related to the happiness element that you highlighted here. Now, we have happiness index that comes in. Every nation publishes some of these reports in terms of how happy the entire nation is. So is there a way that we can map all of this information to that and see what's playing out in there?
Yes, I mean, what is unfortunate is that we don't have this particular score for this method beforehand, but there is a score for international happiness, and then what you could do is just rescale this as a 1 to 5 and set that against, I think it's a 0 to 10 scale, the international happiness study. So we could look at two ways. You could stretch the 1 to 5 version of the 5 faces, or you could be a bit more scientific and find out what is the mean and standard deviation of the international scale, what is the mean and standard deviation of this scale, and then stretch them that way so that they corresponded. But the thing to do would be to take the happiness scale that we have used and make it like the international one.
Sure. And do you have any a few positive measures that that perhaps you may want to recommend or share for the industry bodies in general?
I think that a lot of what is happening at the moment is already good. So there are lots of things that are happening around the world, and some of these are, I'm sure, are happening in India too. So people are having the ability to dial into groups to discuss topics, but actually they're quite often social as well, which is fine. There are support pages, COVID access kits on most of the trade body sites where you can download lots and lots of free resources. So all of that is good. There's been some fantastic lobbying in the United Kingdom by the MRS, by the head of the MRS, the chief executive, Jane Frost, who's been lobbying government because we have lots of incentive schemes. We have lots of schemes from the government to protect employment, but quite often the nature of market research contracts means that sometimes we fall through the gaps. So she has been lobbying to make sure that those are taken care of there. Melanie Courtwright, who is the head of the Insights Association in America, has been tackling in particular the no competes rule. So some companies in America wanted to fire people and still insist that these people who have been fired didn't go and work for their competitors. And there's been a big campaign to make that impossible, because obviously that is morally bankrupt. So things that are happening at the moment, I think, are good. And if the MRSI wants to look around and share the things that it is doing that are great with other people and then learn from other people, that is good. What I don't see enough of is what's next. So what sort of industry do we want to be in? What are the key things that we want to be focusing on? How do we drive this forward? So the MRS, coming back to UK again, has really moved well to take its face-to-face training courses and move them online. But actually, once you do that, you should start thinking, now what is the long-term direction this should be taking us? Should it be more international? Should it be around a whole day doing this? Should it accumulate accreditation as part of that? So there is scope even within that to rethink how we go forward. And I think this reimagining the industry is something we should be doing as the second box. So the first box, I think we're doing a good job of. Look after our people, look after things, manage business as it's happening today. The second box, which is really start creating the future, is not happening so much, and it's the leaders of the industry that need to be doing that.
I think that's a brilliant point, reimagining things. And I think that's a great point. That's a good takeaway of it. Thanks a lot, Ray. I'm sure
Pleasure.
folks have some more questions, but what we could do is we could have all of these questions collated, and we could share this with you. And just want to mention one of the key elements, which I'm sure you have touched about it in the early part, is that what makes me least happy is that I miss my tradition. There used to be a tradition of having drinks on together on Fridays, and we share our experiences and difficulties, which is sorely missed now. But I hope when things get restored to normal, we'll get back to the old good old days and times.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Ray. Thank you so much for your time. We're looking forward to, if you're running another wave, looking forward to the updated version of the results.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there are some more questions which will come in through. We'll share them with you.
Thanks.
Yeah. And before we sign off, I just want to let you know that we know there is a new insight ecosystem happening. The world is radically different, and your peer community is here to help. We are organizing a few webinars, special webinars specifically during COVID, where we will touch upon various elements. For example, the first element that we intend touching upon is rising to the challenge. What are the new alternative ways to seek information from respondents that can help us to gain insights? The other point that we will be, the other webinar that we will be soon having is related to innovating, all kind of innovations that are going in there, and we will touch upon that. And we will also have, there's a considerable amount of data that resides in every organization. How can we unlock the new value with this data? Now, I'm personally very excited about it. I think we have, these are all brilliant topics, and we have some really cool speakers from the MR space, and we will roll out the communication. So please do register and sign in. We have another webinar coming up, our monthly webinar, which is slated for the 17th of June. It's all about the digital and the digital footprints that people leave, digital ethnography. And this webinar, the speaker for this webinar is Mr. Madhavan Srinivasan. He is a partner at Quantum Consumer Solutions. So please do sign in for this. It's going to be an interesting session. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much, Ray. This presentation was really brilliant, and the survey was fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you.